Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our last session of today. We appreciate you being here. We are mindful it's already very late, at least in Africa. Today, this last session, we are going to deal with a very interesting question, and that is the protection of intra-brand competition in Africa. Green sprouts, challenges, and how to make it work. The purpose of this discussion is to delve into some solutions in the context of very concentrated distribution markets in Africa. And we have an esteemed panel again. It is Johannes Holzwarth. Johannes is a case handler officer at the European Commission at the DG Competition in Brussels. Welcome, Johannes. We have Mohamed Elfar, Dr. Mohamed and his counsel at Baker McKenzie in Egypt. We have Mpumi Mazibuko. He is an independent legal and business consultant, and he's the former vice president and general counsel for the Coca-Cola Africa operating unit. Welcome, Mpumi. We have Paulus Hangula, and Paulus is the Director of Enforcement and Exemptions and Cartels at the Namibian Competition Commission, and then Rana Khoweiled, the Head of Mergers and Acquisitions at the Egypt Competition Authority. We are very glad and grateful to you for joining us for this panel discussion on intra-brand competitive dynamics. Intra-brand competition has traditionally been labeled as the stepchild of antitrust. And from a US perspective, this particular bias has originated in a case, the Continental Sylvania case, and that goes long back to 1977. And in this case, the whole notion was introduced that inter-brand competition was the main concern of competition or antitrust, and that an exercise of intra-brand market power would be sufficiently disciplined by inter-brand competition. And many competition authorities, including South Africa, adopted this perspective without perhaps sufficient awareness of the critique against this simplification, which included its lack of empirical support, failure to provide a clear analytical method for balancing competitive effects, and perhaps an over-reliance on simplistic tests like market power screens, which sidestepped rigorous economic analysis. Important lessons on intra-brand competition had subsequently been shared by economists like Robert Steiner, Warren Grimes, and backed by empirical evidence. Among others, they said that vigorous inter-brand competition does not, in itself, discipline the exercise of intra-brand market power. Competition across the value chain, including intra-brand competition, matters in the supply chain power struggles, which they refer to as vertical competition, not to be confused with vertical integration or vertical relationships, but that inter-supply chain power struggles significantly affect competition between levels of the supply chain, and absolute market power and absolute market shares are not reliable case screeners. It's a much more dynamic analysis and much more relational as opposed to absolute analysis. From an African perspective, the Egypt Competition Authority issued its guidelines on vertical restraints last year, and it's quite a sophisticated guideline on vertical restraints, and probably the most sophisticated in Africa that we have at the moment. The ECA also won an award for that document, so congratulations for that, Rana. The ECA also prioritized the promotion of intra-brand competition over the past couple of years, and we expect that the learnings of the ECA may be adopted elsewhere in Africa, especially due to this focus on concentrated distribution markets, which have already attracted significant fines. So today's panel will share some case studies and enforcement challenges and policy design issues, and discuss how intra-brand competition can be optimized and how distribution models impact some of these considerations. So, Mohamed, if I can start with you, when did the Egypt Competition Authority, in your view, start to pay special attention to the benefits of intra-brand competition, especially considering this long-standing traditional focus on the importance of inter-brand competition? Was there a particular trigger event?
Thank you very much, Odie, for this session and for arranging this conference and your team. It's a
Oh,
pleasure to be here with you.
excellent.
So to your question, I think your introduction, I agree with your introduction completely that
Mm,
that the idea of interbrand competition being the main purpose of competition law has like came out in the US, and I think and I agree with you, it has influenced many competition jurisdictions worldwide, including Egypt. If we look at Egypt from 2005 until 2018 or 19, we've only had one single like case restriction like a vertical restraints case. However, afterwards, as you said, there was a change in policy,
yeah,
and we're seeing way more cases and way more enforcement for RPM, restrictions on passive sales, and
yeah,
territorial restrictions,
yeah.
MFN. All these became like within the core interest of the ECA, as Rana will explain later through cases.
Mm,
It became very in the heart of enforcement. I think the reasons behind this shift in policy are the economic challenges faced by Egypt due to like global like turbulences,
mm,
where the competition authority became in the heart of the governmental policy on how to address market failures and to make sure that there is more competition and lower prices to consumers.
mm,
And this is evident by the number of cases brought by the ECA. Historically, until 2018, maybe there was maximum 5 or 6 violation cases per year. However, we're seeing now like an average of 27th or even
yeah,
35 cases in some years.
sure.
Um, yeah. Of course, we would hope that the ECA would issue press releases for all of the of the cases they issue, but we know that the competition authority is way more active now, and in particular when it comes to vertical restraints, and I think that it. And the second reason I have to say, the second reason quickly, is
Yeah.
that the ECA chairman from 2018 and 2021 are practitioners of competition law and have academic background in
Uh-huh.
competition law. So I think this also has
Hmm.
helped in bringing Egypt more in line with international best practices, most importantly with the EU and EU member states.
That's very interesting. That academic link.
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you for that. And I must say I'm still very impressed that the solution was found in intrabrand competition because for many authorities that would not have clicked. Rana, the vertical guidelines incorporate significant learnings from some of your cases to date. Can you highlight some of those learnings and some of those cases just fairly shortly? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Lucy, for your invitation. Let me
Yes.
start with highlighting the key learnings from the vertical restraints guidelines. Actually, the Egyptian Competition Authority issued its guidelines recently on vertical restraints. And I think that these guidelines represent a major step toward articulating how to assess vertical restraints under Article 7 of the Egyptian competition law. These guidelines reflect also the international recent developments, but also ECA's accumulated practical experience in key sectors.
Mm.
And these guidelines were developed actually in order to emphasize on the fact that under Article 7, there is a general prohibition of vertical agreements. So as ECA engaged in many practical cases, it was evident that we need more practical guidance, more structured guidance in order to achieve more strong compliance and also enforcement of Article 7 of the Egyptian competition law. So drawing on this experience, the guidelines identify the vertical restraints that are likely to raise competition concerns, such as resale price maintenance, restriction on passive sales, and wide MFN clauses. But also the guidelines provide the general framework for assessing more nuanced vertical restraints, such as exclusive dealings, single branding, and non-compete clause. And I think beyond enforcement, these guidelines serve a wider purpose, which is to promote transparency, legal certainty, proactive compliance. And of course, it serves to support Egyptian courts when applying Article 7 of the Egyptian competition law.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Rana. And I must say now that Mohamed has said that there are about 35 cases per year, I also understand that there's been a lot of underlying resources available for that guidelines.
Yes, certainly.
And just before we step off this Egypt issue, I'd just like to hear, Mohamed, from you as well, that intra-brand competition, and that has been the critique of it, especially in South Africa from the private sector, that intra-brand could in certain instances carry the seeds of its own destruction because it requires the intra-brand competitors to compete the price away, as they said in some of our discussions, some of our case law. Has that also been your experience in the market? That is a typical complaint, or are there other permutations of intra-brand competition that are more sustainable?
We've actually seen mixed reactions from businesses on how they reacted to increasing competition enforcement in intra-brand competition. On one hand, there's this company that I have to say came to realize that it lacked bookkeeping, systems, internal systems, that they had no idea about the amount of supply that they are supplying their distributors, as they were predominantly relying on RPM to control prices. So when they came to change this model, they found out that they lacked the controls or even the knowledge on the side of the market, is because they were oversupplying. So as a result, the internal decision of the company was to comply with the law, and also place internal bookkeeping systems in order to be able to understand the market and deal with those dynamics accordingly. So I think that this was a positive effect that came from increasing competition in intra-brand competition. As for we've also seen another example of, where a company due to economic challenges, the authorized dealers of a certain product were unable to provide sufficient supply. As a result, there was a flooding of parallel imports from outside Egypt. Due to the increasing competition and focus on intra-brand competition, the main supplier or the authorized dealers had little ability to block or to restrict parallel imports. And so it ended up a situation where 70% of the supply of this product was from parallel imports, and 30% only through authorized distributors.
Mm.
But I also have to say that this was a temporary situation, and once the economic situation improved, the authorized dealers were like back on track, and things have improved significantly. So as you can see, like there's a mixed reaction
Yeah.
on how market players perceived increasing enforcement in intra-brand competition.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Mohamed. Johannes, can you share with us the history of the consideration of intra-brand competition from an EU perspective, and discuss with us how that pendulum has swung?
Yes, thank you very much. So obviously, I'm here speaking as in my private capacity, not necessarily the position of the Commission.
Yeah.
But as you may have read also in the profile, I've been involved in I was involved in the new vertical block exemption regulation that was adopted in 2022, and together with the vertical guidelines. And in that context, the Commission has conducted a fairly thoroughly review or revision of the existing block exemption regulation. And in that context, we also adopted a staff working document on the evaluation of the vertical block exemption regulation. And there you find some really nice bits and pieces about the history of vertical restraints and how they have been treated under EU competition law in the past. And I mean, if we want to go all the way back to the original provisions in the treaty in the 50s, when the European EU treaties were put in place. I mean, you look at Article 101, which is the prohibition of restrictive agreements, and Article 102, abuse of dominance. If you want to follow this up until now, what is now Article 101 and Article 102, you see no distinction between horizontal and vertical agreements. And the question was, does this also apply to vertical agreements? And since then, the question about intra-brand competition, and that's what we're talking about today, has really developed around vertical agreements. And the case law, the Court of Justice has really provided a push. And at the same time, the Commission was the sole enforcer that also had the power to grant an exemption of the prohibition that applied to vertical agreements as well as it did apply to horizontal agreements. And then I think there's an important point. In 1965, the EU Council adopted an empowerment regulation that empowered the Commission to adopt block exemption regulations. And this was meant to help the Commission because it was flooded with notifications of vertical agreements. And then the Commission, on that basis, adopted many different block exemption regulations, such as for exclusive distribution, franchise, motor vehicles, etc. So general block exemption regulations that related to specific distribution systems, as well as more sector-specific block exemption regulations. And then another shift so that was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then in the 90s, we see the more economic approach picking up in the EU. There was a policy paper, a discussion paper as to where do we go with verticals, and you've mentioned it. There was also the push from the US, where vertical restraints have been treated slightly differently than what some perceived as a more formalistic approach in the EU with the block exemption regulations, etc. And this more economic approach that was adopted at the end of the 90s has then prevailed also when it comes to verticals and how the Commission now assesses vertical restrictions, vertical restraints. And another important point was the adoption of Regulation 1/2003, which is more of a procedural point, but I think it's important to bring this into the perspective, because this meant that companies had to self-assess, so truly self-assess under Article 101, Article 102 as well, but we're focusing on Article 101. And then the function of the block exemption regulation also for vertical agreements shifted a bit in providing more guidance and providing a safe harbor for companies that engage in vertical agreements. And I think that was an important point, and therefore the block exemption regulation regarding vertical agreements is a safe harbor. It comes always in a package with vertical guidelines that explain how that works in practice, but it also goes a little bit beyond, and it brings in the enforcement framework for not only the EU Commission, but also for the national competition authorities of the member states. So it provides a framework of analysis for the Commission and for national competition authorities, as well as national courts in the EU member states that look at the vertical guidelines and how they approach it. And the vertical guidelines coming now to the substance, I mean, they're based on this idea that absent market power at the intrabrand level, we should be fairly relaxed with intrabrand restrictions.
Yes.
But we've mentioned it before, RPM, passive sales restrictions. These are classical examples also of previous vertical block exemption regulations for which the safe harbor did not apply. That doesn't mean that there were possibilities to take into account efficiencies, but in general, this was seen as a proxy by many to categorize such vertical restrictions as being severe restrictions of intra-brand competition that would merit intervention. And last point, I'm very happy also to hear how it works, for example, in Egypt, that the same type of restrictions are also discussed there in the context of guidelines, and that there's also enforcement action, because policy documents are always, they are grounded or influenced on the basis of enforcement action, and the same is true for the EU Commission and also enforcement actions at national level. And when we did the evaluation of the previous vertical block exemption regulation, we also took stock of what has happened, and there indeed in the last couple of years, decades, there have been more and more enforcement actions also in relation to vertical restrictions by the Commission as well as national competition authorities. And these are super helpful to then take this into account to bring the policy forward that is reflected in the vertical block exemption regulation and the vertical guidelines. And one last point on substance, the last review has really taken into account e-commerce, platforms, and this is something where we really need to think about our traditional concept of vertical restraints, vertical agreements, horizontal agreements, interbrand, intrabrand reaches some limits, and the new vertical block exemption regulation tries to take all of this into account and bring some fresh guidance for companies to self-assess, but also for us as the Commission to have a up-to-date framework for enforcement. So that's in a nutshell. I mean, there are many aspects to it, but this is what I would say in terms of substance and also procedure, what's important to keep in mind when we want to bring in the historical perspective now from the EU.
Thank you very much, Johannes. That's very interesting, and it has a long history. I'm impressed. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you very much. Paulus, can you share with us the NACC's experience? Fairly recently, you've been through the OEM's investigation regarding dealerships and the panel beaters, and that's been very interesting. And if you could possibly just share that whole experience with us and the findings that you had and what you are trying to do about that.
Thank you very much, Odie. I'm very happy to be here to share as well as to learn from some of the more experienced and bigger economists out there. In terms of what we have been doing from our side, we have been seeing a number of cases where the issue of intra-brand competition has come up. Now, the reason for that is because we have a close relationship with South Africa, and most of the manufacturers and bigger companies are based in South Africa, and they set up distributors arrangements through Namibian smaller companies to distribute their products. Now, in terms of the automotive industry, maybe firstly just to explain that most of the new vehicles that are sold in Namibia are assembled through South Africa. And even those that are assembled elsewhere, South Africa is the main regional hub through which they are distributed. Now, some of you may know a few years ago, there were concerns that were raised in South Africa in the automotive market. The Competition Commission of South Africa did some work and introduced some guidelines. Some of those concerns were also raised here in Namibia, and between 2020 and 2024, we investigated the market, which included South African OEMs, local dealers, as well as panel beaters, for possible restrictive arrangements and abuse of dominance. Now, I must mention here that most of the new vehicles that are sold in Namibia come with a service plan, as well as a warranty cover, which is sold as a package. So at the end of the investigation, some of the issues that we uncovered is that we found there are restrictions by some of the OEMs based in South Africa in terms of appointment of dealers to sell new vehicles, as well as OEM approved parts. Now, we found that such OEMs only approve a limited number of dealers, in some cases only one, even where there has been attempts actually for new entrants to come into the market. Some businesses actually wanted to also enter into these distributorship agreements in order to distribute some of the brands and ultimately improve inter-brand competition. So because of these restrictions, in my view, it limits intra-brand competition in the sales of those vehicles, as well as parts of those vehicles. Secondly, we also found restrictions by some of the OEMs in terms of appointment of approved panel beaters. So what happens is that once a car is sold, you have the after-sales service where if a car is involved in a collision, a panel beater will need to be, of course, contacted and then repair the car. So what we found was that some of these OEMs only appoint a limited number of panel beaters, at the same time only appoint a limited number of service agents to provide maintenance. And this was mainly enforced for cars that were still under service plan as well as warranty. Again, this, in my view, which is also the opinion that we have arrived at the end of the investigation, is that it limits intra-brand competition, not necessarily at the value chain of when the car is sold, but at the next level of the value chain, which is after-sales service. So those were the issues that we found in that investigation.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you very much, Paulus. And you mentioned as well in that press release that you are in the process of putting a guideline together. What made you decide to go for the guideline route as opposed to an enforcement approach?
Perhaps what I can say is that we take a lot of guidance from South Africa. I think South Africa is one of the best, in my views, competition authority out there. They do have some soft regulation activities. They also did that in the automotive industry. Now, in terms of our act, not all matters that we investigate where we found a restriction, we will make a conclusion of prosecution. We do have powers in terms of our act, which allows the Commission to introduce interventions in order to improve market condition. That is one of the reasons. The other reason is that the automotive industry is not an easy one, I can say, to look at. because as much as there is, and you did mention from the onset, as much as there is inter-brand competition between various brands to a larger extent, various factors such as vehicle size, for example, vehicle usage, performance, fuel economy, brand reputation, brand loyalty, brand preference, those factors make a case for one to consider or to be concerned with limiting of intra-brand competition within the automotive industry. Because at the end of the day, and what we did in this case was that we did a consumer survey. And at the end of the day, we did actually found that there are certain consumers that would prefer a certain vehicle. And they would want to only buy a certain brand. Where we have seen that there is inter-brand competition, you will see that consumers tend to cross-shop between various dealers selling the same car. And the dealers recognize such competition and they would want to, you did mention the issue of competition on price. That is one of the ways in which dealers selling the same car can compete on. But what we also seen is that they also compete on how a package or a vehicle is sold, the consumer experience. Perhaps they can add accessories and so on. So there is more than just price competition when it comes to intra-brand competition, in my views. This is what we have learned through this investigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulus. That's very interesting. And what was also very striking is that there are different inter-brand competitors deciding to sell through one retailer or through one dealership. And that's a double whammy. That's a double whammy. Sole distribution, the distribution ship, plus no intra-brand competition. And a couple of years ago, I was writing an article and I was reading that recently. It's so long ago, the whole article was news for me. But one of the points that were made was basically from the research that they found that the real competition, even when there are a couple of inter-brand competitors on the shelves, the real competition is not between, it's not the choice between those within one retailer. It is having two retailers with a complete set on the shelves. This is what is actually promoting competition. So it was just fascinating to read all of that type of economic analysis again. Mpumi, if we can get to you, and without divulging any information about your past employer, but just in general, if you could indicate the different forms of distribution that are typically associated with consumer brands, how would you describe them, and to which extent do they promote intra-brand competition, and is intra-brand competition really necessary? If you can give us your views on the types of distribution systems.
Sure, Odie. And once again, thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference, and also to learn and exchange learnings with my co-panelists. And I must say, you make it sound very sinister, my past life, but I'm sure we have had some house rules, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion and debate. So in terms of the business models that we'd have in a business that is similar to the Coke system, you would have various forms of distribution that really respond to the local climate and nuances and dynamics, but also try to marry that with the international experience. And some of these key models that you would find would typically be, for example, the franchise distributor arrangement model, where you would have independent entities that are essentially licensed to produce and distribute brands or branded proprietary products in designated exclusive territories. And these entities would handle typically manufacturing, packaging, and the logistical elements behind all of that. And then you'd also have what we refer to as manual distribution centers, MDCs. And this model is quite common in Africa. These are essentially found in small-scale hubs that service informal retailers and traders. And MDCs allow for that final push across the line to reach underserved or remote areas in order to meet consumer needs. So there's a definite need for that kind of approach. You also have third-party distributors. These are quite common also. These will be independent logistics companies or wholesalers that distribute products, often in rural and fragmented markets. As you can imagine, having a Pan-African business, you require that sort of agility.
Yeah.
So they come in very relevant. And then you also have direct store delivery, DSDs. These entities essentially deliver directly to retail outlets, and they bypass the intermediary, the middleman. This model is really quite consumer-centric, I think, in that it meets the promise to consumers in terms of delivering a product on the shelves, and a product that is fresh and ready for consumption. And then you have micro distributors. These are quite far and few in between. This model is used in densely populated peri-urban areas and would be executed in an agile, entrepreneurial manner to deliver to small, convenient stores, and similar informal traders. The final one, I would argue, is a dual distribution model, where you would have a company-owned channel, and you would also have independent distributors servicing a market, and these may be utilized in a more flexible manner to be able to meet immediate market needs on a large scale.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mpumi. Would all of those distributors have exclusive areas where they would be distributing? Or would one find that there are an overlap of areas where they would deliver their products?
Good question. Look, it's a hybrid in reality. You would have a situation where there is exclusivity that is granted, but that is really motivated by what the economic or socio-economic factors are. It's a question of responding to the market dynamics and the market demands. And all of this is obviously crafted with having thought out what the market requires and if it makes economic rational sense to have that sort of model. And then in some instances, you will have, like I said, a hybrid situation where you will allow for that flexibility, where you want to have a selection of entities that are able to service the market and not just limited to a few. So that's where that intrabrand market efficiency would come in.
I see. And Mpumi, all of those distribution systems that one would find in these industries, do I understand correctly that they are demand-side driven, or have some of them been in response to, let's say, particular case law or policy, competition policy or competition remedies in general, or are they still fairly unfettered and organic?
Yeah.
If you're able to speak to that.
No, most definitely. I think you raise a very important question there. To what extent are these driven by organic growth or the imposition of remedies by the relevant authorities? Look, typically in most business models, these are structured in a fashion where they would evolve organically. Especially for entities, brand owners, proprietary owners that are embedded and invested in a particular jurisdiction, these would develop organically. And they will be shaped by, the geography, infrastructure, and consumer behavior. However, I think it would be fair to say that some catalysts are because of regulatory interventions. And we have case law and we have instances in Southern Africa, as was raised by a colleague of mine, that really set good precedent for how these sorts of issues and dynamics can be dealt with. For example, in my erstwhile position, we dealt with the Coca-Cola beverages merger consolidation of the bottlers, where the authorities imposed public interest conditions. You'll remember this well, I'm sure, Odie, where the entities that were merging were required to have conditions that protected jobs and also promoted small to medium enterprise participation. Indirectly, this really did influence distribution models. All right. That's from my particular universe. And then flip it over to the Massmart Walmart instance, that case. That case came a few years prior to our matter, where authorities imposed a public interest conditions to address concerns around local suppliers being negatively impacted and also to curb job losses. Now, to mitigate these concerns, the regulators required the establishment of a supplier development fund, quite significant in both cases. And this was aimed at supporting and integrating local and small to medium enterprises into that supply chain that Massmart now had access into through the Walmart universe. So I would argue that this also influenced the distribution model. And just to end off by saying that in the Massmart and also the CCBA mergers, you know, these funds help some suppliers in a positive way, I would argue, that really does go to arguing the case for intra-brand models, in that it helped them to upscale, also to improve quality and integrate into a larger supply chain and distribution network. You know, therefore, the core system, I would argue, is not necessarily, well, yeah, it is market driven. However, that regulatory intervention can play a positive factor and a catalyst in how the whole ecosystem is shaped.
That's right. And you make a very important link between the intra-brand model and the Coca-Cola business or any other big beverage business in terms of incorporating an intra-brand competitor into an established supply chain. And that is actually a very good idea to promote both intra-brand competition as well as incorporating a new player into a very established supply chain. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mpumi.
Sure. Just to mention that you touched on something very relevant, and especially in concentrated or sensitive markets. I would argue the case for that sort of approach where that regulatory intervention is a positive dynamic to it.
Yeah, you opened my eyes here for something. I appreciate that. Rana, can you please share with us the main cases and the main approaches to an intra-brand competition analysis? And you can limit it. It's not necessary to go through all of them. You can maybe highlight a typical intra-brand competitive analysis that you would do, just to give us an indication of how would that analysis work.
Yes, of course, Odie. So let me start with the most prominent examples in Egypt, which relates to the electronics sector. Actually, ECA investigated around 10 suppliers of home appliances and over 10,000 distribution contracts, which were concluded with independent distributors, which are basically small retail outlets and also organized retailers, such as large modern trade chains. And actually, ECA's investigation revealed a number of vertical restraints which were included in these contracts, such as resale price maintenance, where suppliers obliged and imposed on distributors fixed and minimum resale prices, leaving them, of course, with no flexibility to compete on prices. Also, we found wide MFN clauses, which required suppliers to offer similar or better terms and conditions to one distributor as to any other. And of course, ECA found these violations to violate Article 7 of the Egyptian competition law, which states that agreements and contracts that are concluded between a person and its suppliers or customers are prohibited if they are intended to restrict competition. And consequently, the clauses were amended by the relevant persons in order to remove any vertical restraints and to restore competitive conditions. Another major case took place in the dairy sector, where ECE uncovered similar violations, including resale price maintenance also, and restriction on passive sales, and also non-compete clauses. And actually also ECA similarly found these contracts to violate Article 7 of the Egyptian competition law and obliged parties to amend these clauses in order to bring their conduct in compliance with the law. Other than these two cases, we had handled many similar issues in many other sectors, such as the education sector. And that's why, precisely why we have issued our guidelines, our vertical restraint guidelines, that provided more clarity to businesses, helping them to comply with the ECL, and of course, ultimately protecting intra-brand competition.
Thank you very much, Rana. Yes, those are very strong cases. Thank you so much for that. Johannes, if you must give some advice in relation to industries that are better suited to intra-brand competition than others, would you be able to do that? Is that a fair question? Or do you find that it is fairly similarly applied across industries?
So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good and challenging question, because if I look at the vertical block exemption regulation and the vertical guidelines as the centerpiece of policy and legislation put in place by the Commission, I have to note that this is not sector specific. It applies across all sectors. Now, have we seen issues in certain sectors and have we pursued cases in certain sectors? Absolutely. I mean, we've had cases concerning consumer electronics, merchandise, licensing, etc. So these were Article 101, so restrictive agreements cases, and we've also achieved some remedies there. At the same time, we've also had, I think, and this is one of the areas that you need to take into account as well, and that is the abuse of dominance area, so Article 102. So when I've spoken at conferences before with colleagues from the US, they would also include this analysis of market power and take into account this monopolization idea. And I think this is something, if you transpose this to the EU, this would be abuse of dominance. And of course, we also have cases when it comes to exclusivity and different types of restrictions that you would find in a vertical supply chain, and these are also not necessarily limited to certain sectors. That said, we also had a e-commerce sector inquiry before the review of the current vertical, or before the review of the previous vertical block exemption regulation that led to the adoption of the new vertical block exemption regulation. And I mean, in the e-commerce sector, we also saw some restrictions, RPM cases following from the e-commerce sector inquiry. So e-commerce is something quite important also when we take into account other policies of the Commission. And if we look at, for example, passive sales restrictions, it was mentioned by other panelists, passive sales restrictions under the vertical block exemption regulation are qualified as a hardcore restriction, so a severe restriction of competition. But what you have to take into account when looking at passive sales restriction is the idea of having an integrated internal market that comprises all the member states. So Whereas RPM, for example, resale price maintenance, you can make a case of, a very severe restriction of intra-brand competition that even below the level of 30% of the market shares involved, you can run a case as a competition authority rather credibly. For passive sales restrictions, the internal market objective really comes into play, that there needs to be parallel trade because we believe that the internal market needs to be integrated, and companies establishing artificially boundaries between member states that prevent parallel trade is something that would go against that very objective of the EU, and that you need to take into account. And one final point there is that is related to parallel trade restrictions, e-commerce. These concern online restrictions, online sales restrictions.
Yeah.
Online sales have been a very powerful tool to promote the internal market that allows manufacturers and distributors to sell from one member state into another member state fairly easily. And restrictions of online sales restrictions were therefore seen as something that would qualify as a hardcore restriction under the previous vertical block exemption regulation. And now in the context of the evaluation and review, the question arose, is it really justified to be so strict on online sales restrictions because they may bring about efficiencies that we need to take into account? And is it still justified to trade online sales restrictions as hardcore restrictions? And that explains a bit why we've added another hardcore restriction specifically dealing with online sales restrictions. There's another point on online advertising restrictions. So I think if you ask me about a specific sector that has played a very prominent role in the couple of last years, I think it will be the e-commerce sector. So that justifies also the e-commerce sector inquiry, and that had a huge impact on the revision of the vertical block exemption regulation. Vertical restraints, vertical agreements, while being everywhere across all sectors, I mean, digitalization is also across all sectors.
Exactly.
And therefore, this is something where I think this is challenging us, and this has been a focus, and that also led to certain cases in that very sector of e-commerce.
Thank you, Johannes. That's fascinating. Digital is also very popular in Africa. ECOWAS, for example, is not just, but they finalized a large block-wide study into digital in relation to certain aspects of that. And many African countries are also focusing on that. So it's also good to know what the EU situation and experience is in that regard. Thank you for that. Mohamed, if you could formulate a policy that would promote intra-brand competition, how would you envisage that? If we consider the whole issue of the risk associated with dealers competing the price away, is it something that can be sustainable outside of very strong other type of measures like exclusivity? What do you think? What would be the components to make it a sustainable policy?
Yeah, thank you very much, Odie. I think also, at least in the context of Egypt and African countries, there's, like in the question, there's an assumption that once we open up competition, intra-brand competition, that there will be fierce competition, and then their price will be zero. I mean, in theory it's possible, and I'm sure it happened in some cases. But for example, in Egypt, I know, like in one case, there was a single distributor of a supplier. They've opened up the market and appointed 5 other distributors, and as a result, prices were still increasing. What happened afterwards is that this supplier was inquiring on whether it can impose maximum pricing because it wants to curb the prices instead of the idea or the assumption that distributors will compete fiercely.
Yeah.
Well, it's not really. I mean, it can happen, but I mean, not necessarily.
Good point.
So I think first thing is that companies should not be too scared or too worried about inter-brand competition. Of course, there are tools such as maximum pricing or exclusive dealing whenever it's legal. They can also be used as means of regulating the market, if I may use this term, and maintaining. Unfortunately, Egypt, for example, we don't have a selective distribution system mechanism. Maybe if this is introduced in Egypt, it would be one method by which certain brands would be able to qualify to selective distribution and get some benefits from there to somehow control the market or like the prices or like prevent cross supplies somehow. So I mean, there isn't a magic solution. It's a developing area. We're still in the phase of seeing reactions from clients. As I told you, in one case, the market was flooded by parallel imports. In another case, like appointing 5 distributors led to price increases and not the other way around. So I mean, it's hard to provide one solution that fits all. But as I said, maximum pricing and selective distribution can be a solution if available in Egypt, and also exclusivity in some cases whenever legal. If there is no market power, it can be helpful in this regard.
Thank you, Mohamed. That's a very interesting perspective, and maybe some of those intra-brand competitors can ask Mpumi about all of the permutations that he has just listed for us. And Mpumi, if you could give advice to the competition authorities of Africa on how to articulate policies influencing the distribution level or the distribution line. Have you picked up something that doesn't work so well, which you would love them to tweak whenever they come up with remedies?
Sure. Look, that's a very good one, Odie, and far be it for me to give the regulators and authorities advice. However, from my empirical experience, there are some do's and don'ts that I think would actually be positive for regulators and also for enterprises, for business.
Yeah.
In terms of the do's, I would really encourage regulators to encourage selective or non-exclusive distributorship arrangements to allow for multiple retailers, especially in environments that are highly concentrated, because you simply can't have that sort of situation existing without interventions. If you really apply yourself to it, you can see that the situation can't hold. You need to open up and democratize markets. Yeah. Another one is, to monitor vertical restraints. The purpose of regulators is to look after the interests of consumers. That is their purpose, and rightly so. And look out for, resale price maintenance, exclusivity where it's not warranted. These issues do need to have oversight on them. Another point will be to support informal and SME distributors through training, and one of the panelists mentioned the digital universe is growing at an exponential rate. And in environments that are in the developing world, that's a crucial one. Yeah. And for SMEs, I would argue that authorities, it's a responsibility on them to really focus on upskilling these smaller players in the broader universe, and to use merger remedies to open up distribution channels and to promote inclusive growth. Tying up to my first initial point. Now, the converse to that, the don'ts, I would avoid imposing blanket provisions on vertical arrangements in instances where there are efficiencies and they can be clearly illustrated. Because you do have instances where economic rationale dictates that you have those sorts of arrangements, and there is no harm on the market that is anti-competitive. So yeah, there are gentlemen and ladies there that are very intelligent, far intelligent than me, a lowly lawyer. And you need to really apply your mind as to what happens in the market on the ground operationally.
Yeah.
And this also comes with it, avoid over-regulating informal distribution, which often, I think, impacts on existing livelihoods and market access for people. And don't assume that intra-brand competition is always pro-consumer, as was mentioned by the previous speaker. Yeah. So it's not always a silver bullet. You have to look at these things in context.
Yes. That is very interesting. Thank you very much, Mpumi. And it also goes back to that point that I mentioned in the introduction regarding vertical competition and the buying power in relation to different levels of the supply chain. It's much more of a relational analysis than just a mere lineal or linear assessment. Exactly. Thank you very much, Mpumi. Rana, just a question on your side. As the Egypt Competition Authority imposed in merger context remedies trying to influence distribution markets and trying to make it more pro-competitive in merger context?
Actually, our merger control regime is very recent. It started in June 2024. Yeah. So we didn't issue yet any condition clearances that tackle this point, the point on distribution relationships and the behavior remedies in general. However, I think that it will be a crucial part that ECA will focus on, especially that many of the markets in Egypt are very highly concentrated when it comes to the upstream levels. So I think that remedies focusing on distribution agreements and how to ensure intra-brand competition in this regard would be considered by ECA, of course.
Yes, thank you, Rana. And Paulus, just the last question to you too. What do you foresee will the guidelines in relation to the OEM study contain? I'm mindful that it is still in the process of being drafted. If you could give a hint to all of the organizations out there, what may we see? Will, for example, may it look like the ECA's guidelines, or will it look completely different?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, Odie. I think the good thing being part of the competition authority or competition network is that there has been some literature that has been produced at EU. We see it now on the African continent, either guidelines, case law. For us, as I've indicated, what we have used is the South African guidelines. Yeah. As an inspiration for us to also consider our guidelines. In fact, as we speak, we are preparing for consultations with our colleagues in South Africa. We have some draft guidelines that have been put in place, some ideas in terms of what we are looking at. Yeah. But what we intend to do is that in the coming days, we would engage the colleagues in South Africa, firstly just for further guidance, and then also to get some clarity on certain things that we saw in the guidelines that has been produced by the South African Competition Commission. Yeah. Now, the good thing with consulting with South Africa is that we have a very close economic relationship. I mean, we use the South African rand as well. Most of the companies operating in Namibia are originally from South Africa. But I think in general, in terms of competition law, I think there is a consensus regardless of where the authority is coming from, because at the end of the day, the aim is to try and ensure that there is healthy competition in any market. So We would also be looking at the ECA's guideline as well, just to learn a few things, and perhaps also adopt some of the provisions from there. Of course, taking into account whether they apply to our market or not, or I believe they would.
They may,
But I think in general, the whole idea is to try and just open up the market. Of course, there has been some argument to say it's a relatively small market. It may not support one or two or more dealers selling the same brand. But I think what we have seen from those that were interested to enter the market was to say, I can set up a dealer and I don't necessarily need to sell one single brand. Why can I not be a multi-brand dealership and compete? Or why can I not be a multi-brand repairer, multi-brand panel beater, and so on? So some of the things probably we'll look at, is it possible to, for example, place a minimum number of approved panel beaters by an OEM? How do we encourage OEMs to establish, where possible, regional centers, let's say in major towns? And also, how do we encourage OEMs to ensure fairness in the distribution of work in respect of either volumes of cars that are sold or geographic representation? Because we also saw that these dealers, it's one dealer and it's only operating in the main city. And then consumers in other areas are saying, it's difficult for us, we want to either buy this vehicle, or when we buy this vehicle, it's difficult for us to travel and then take this vehicle for repairs when it needs repairs. So these are some of the things we are looking at, but I think inspiration from our side will definitely draw from our colleagues in South Africa, who look at the guidelines from the ECA and the African continent in general. We have used a lot of the EC's material, and it's something that we'll continue doing. There's lots of publication from Europe, which we have used a lot in the past, and we highly appreciate. And we just commend everyone here to keep up with what they are doing. I think it's helpful to some of us, and even to those authorities that have just been set up to also learn from. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paulus. And you stole my thoughts there, because I'm very proud of all the work that's being done. Let me quickly run through this. And this is from Faranas. Can you please elaborate on the main violation areas the ECA has noted in the nearly 35 cases mentioned? So the main violation areas, and how the ECA approached the investigation and review process, noting the previous lack of case law. That's the first question. Then the second question is there a particular sector that stands out where the ECA is noticing increased cases of vertical restraints? In practice, how does the ECA analyze vertical restraints in line with the derogations under the executive regulations? Could you elaborate on how the ECA analyzes vertical restraints in cases concerning IP rights? And how has the ECA tackled vertical restraints in the Egyptian automotive sector? Those are 5 questions. There are another 2. Does the ECA publish accessible data, even if redacted, about the cases of vertical violation? And also, to what extent can one rely on the EU guidelines if the ECA's guidelines on vertical violations are silent?
I can have a first go on a high level, as far as I know. Of course, like there are aspects which are not in the public domain, so I will not be able to advise on them or comment. So the 35 cases, as reported by the ECA, are mainly in health sector, appliances, as Rana has explained, in education sector, in food sector. So these are the cases that or the areas where the ECA has focused its enforcement, at least in the past year. whether there is a particular sector that is witnessing more enforcement. I mean, like from my own perspective and what I see, I think it might be healthcare and food sector. I think generally like strategic products that can influence inflation can be the main focus currently of the Egyptian Competition Authority. And please, of course, Rana, please correct me if I'm wrong. The analysis of the ECA of vertical restraint generally, I think that the ECA, as mentioned in the guidelines, does take several factors into consideration on the effect and conglomerate effects of and the existence of multiple vertical agreements on the same time within the same sector and the effect of this. And I think that the economic analysis in the ECA, as an outsider, I'm commenting as an outsider, I think that the economic analysis of the ECA is increasing significantly, and the input, and we're seeing that through the RFIs that we supply. And I think that there is now reliance on econometrics more, on price correlations and all these things. So we've been seeing this in the guidelines and also in practice, which I think is very positive.
That's interesting. Rana, any views from your side?
Yeah, actually, regarding the assessment of the different vertical restraints, I think that it's very clarified in the vertical restraints guidelines that we have issued. So you can differentiate between two types of vertical restraints: the ones that are likely to raise competition concerns, and where the guidelines explain exactly what is the assessment that the ECA undergo. And on the other side, we have the vertical restraints, which require more impact assessment, and the guidelines specify the factors that should be taken into account in such assessment. This is for the assessment or the substantive assessment of vertical restraints. Regarding the key sectors, yes, we do have certain sectors that are prioritized to where the promotion of intra-brand competition is a key priority to ECA. These sectors are the ones where the upstream level is highly concentrated and that impact directly consumers, such as food industry, for example, where the upstream consolidation together with restricted distribution agreements could lead to and could affect prices and availability of essential goods. Also, we have the education sector that emerged as a key sector of concern because due to its importance to Egyptian consumers and Egyptian families and the financial burden on the Egyptian families. And we have noticed recently in the school uniform market in specific that schools have tendency to conclude exclusive dealings with a limited number of manufacturers, of school uniform manufacturers. This may lead to increased prices of school uniform on parents, despite it being basic and recurring necessity. And so, yes, we do have key priority sectors. However, this does not mean that the other sectors are disregarded. So, and regarding the other question on the automotive sector, we are working currently on our guidelines regarding this sector. And as for the question on the press releases and how ECA is planning to publish the press releases on its decisions, actually we are working on publishing a non-confidential version of all the reports that have been drafted by ECA. However, it's an ongoing project that may take a little extra time. So, however, stay tuned for our non-confidential reports.
Oh, thank you very much.
From my side.
Thank you very much, Rana. It's really much appreciated. And thank you for those questions. They're all very, very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a pearl of wisdom, but all of it was valuable. I certainly learned a lot. And Paulus, I'll also stay in contact with you. I think there's another document that may be helpful. This has been so great, and let's keep this group together and let's keep learning from each other. It's been really a great privilege, and there you there you get a hand clap from the audience. It's been very, very valuable. Stay well.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
Odie.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye. Bye.